The map of Africa, drawn at the Berlin Conference in 1884, was created by men who had never set foot on the continent, who knew nothing of the kingdoms and cultures and languages and trade routes that had existed for centuries, who drew straight lines across landscapes with rulers and divided peoples with pens, creating borders that served European interests while destroying African political formations that had governed themselves successfully long before Europeans arrived, claiming to bring civilization to lands that had never asked for it and did not need the particular civilization being offered at gunpoint. This was colonialism at its most revealing, the assumption that the world existed to be divided among European powers, that sovereignty was something white people granted or withheld, rather than something all peoples possessed inherently, that resources in distant lands belonged to whoever could extract them, regardless of the people living above those resources, that entire continents could be claimed and carved up and exploited for the benefit of empires that justified their theft through theories of racial superiority and civilizing missions that were always pretexts for economic extraction and political domination. For 5 centuries, European powers, and later the United States and Japan, imposed colonial rule over most of the world's land and most of the world's people, creating a global system where the wealth of some nations was built directly on the impoverishment of others, where independence was deliberately prevented to maintain access to resources and labor, where cultures were systematically destroyed and replaced with fragments of colonizers' languages and religions and legal systems, where the colonized were told they were being uplifted while being systematically exploited, where violence was constant but was called order, where resistance was labeled terrorism while conquest was called progress. The formal empires ended, mostly, in the decades after World War II, when colonized peoples fought for and won independence that had been denied them for generations. But independence often came on terms that preserved colonial economic relationships, that left former colonies with borders designed to create instability, with economies structured around exporting raw materials to former colonizers, with debts that required continued subordination, with political systems that had been designed for extraction rather than for genuine self-governance. The flags changed, but the fundamental relationships of domination and extraction often persisted in forms that were less visible but no less real. Tonight, we trace colonialism from its origins through its formal end to its contemporary legacies, examining not just what was done, but how it was justified, not just the violence, but the systems that made the violence routine, not just the resistance, but why resistance was necessary and why it continues. We explore how the world we inhabit was shaped by centuries of colonial extraction, how the wealth gaps between nations are not natural or accidental, but were created through policies designed to enrich some by impoverishing others, how the racism that justified colonialism persists in structures and assumptions that outlived the formal empires. This is not comfortable history. It challenges narratives about European enlightenment and progress, about the benefits of Western civilization, about the natural superiority that supposedly justified conquest. But discomfort is often where truth lives, in the gap between the stories empires told about themselves and the realities that the colonized experienced, between the rhetoric of development and the reality of extraction, between the promise of partnership and the practice of domination. The city that stretched before Hernan Cortés in November 1519
was unlike anything he or his men had ever seen. Tenochtitlan, rising from the middle of Lake Texcoco, a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people, connected to the mainland by causeways that could be raised or lowered, its canals flowing with canoes carrying goods and people, its temples rising in stepped pyramids that dominated the skyline, its markets selling goods from territories hundreds of miles away, its aqueducts bringing fresh water, its administrative systems governing an empire that stretched across much of what would become Mexico. The Spanish soldiers stared at architecture and urban planning that rivaled or exceeded anything in contemporary Europe, at a civilization that was sophisticated and wealthy and organized, that possessed astronomical knowledge and mathematical systems and written languages and artistic traditions that had developed over centuries without any contact with the old world. But what Cortés saw was gold, and what he concluded was that this wealthy civilization possessed resources that Spain needed, and that being pagan, being outside the Christian faith, being ruled by what he characterized as devil worship and human sacrifice, it was available for conquest, its wealth available for taking, its people available for conversion or enslavement, depending on what served Spanish interests. The justification had been established decades before, codified in documents that Cortés carried with him, in the requerimiento that was read aloud to indigenous peoples in Spanish before battles, the legal formality that demanded they submit to Spanish authority and Christian conversion, or face the consequences of just war that would be waged against them. The requerimiento was extraordinary in its presumption, a document that explained that God had given the world to St. Peter and his successors, the popes, that the Pope had granted the Americas to the Spanish crown, that therefore the indigenous peoples encountered had a choice between accepting Spanish sovereignty and Christian faith, or being conquered through violence that would be their own fault for refusing the generous offer being made. The document was read in a language the listeners could not understand, describing a religion and a political theory they had never encountered, making demands that made no sense in their worldview, and then used their inevitable failure to comply as justification for violence that had been intended, regardless of their response. This was the doctrine of discovery in practice, the legal theory that Christian European monarchs could claim sovereignty over territories inhabited by non-Christians, that discovering lands meant acquiring rights to them even when those lands were inhabited by peoples who had never consented to being claimed, who had their own political systems and sovereignty that the doctrine simply erased through the act of claiming. The theory had been formalized in papal bulls beginning in the 15th century, the Inter Caetera of 1493, dividing the non-European world between Spain and Portugal along a line Pope Alexander VI drew through the Atlantic, the assumption being that the Pope had authority to grant what he did not possess to monarchs who had not earned it, taking from peoples who were not asked and could not refuse. But the Aztec empire that Cortés encountered was not empty land waiting to be claimed, was not primitive society requiring European civilization, was not barbarous people needing to be uplifted. Tenochtitlan was larger than any Spanish city of the period, its markets better organized, its sanitation superior, its architecture impressive enough that Cortés's own letters to Charles V described it in terms of wonder even as he planned its destruction. The Mexica had built an empire through conquest and tribute, had developed sophisticated agricultural systems using chinampas, the floating gardens that allowed intensive cultivation, had established trade networks and legal codes, and a calendar system that demonstrated astronomical knowledge that was advanced by any standard. The human sacrifice that the Spanish used to justify their conquest was real, a central element of Mexica religion that the Spanish found abhorrent and that they weaponized in their propaganda about the barbarism they were supposedly ending. But the violence they used to end it dwarfed what they claimed to be stopping. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, killing tens of thousands. The smallpox that Cortez's forces brought, killing millions more across the subsequent decades. The destruction of the city, and the melting down of its gold artwork, and the burning of its codices, eliminating knowledge and beauty that could never be recovered. The Spanish justified this destruction as bringing civilization, but what they actually brought was extraction, the transformation of complex societies into sources of precious metals and labor, the subordination of peoples to an empire that would take their wealth and give back only the religion and the language, and the political subordination that would be called improvement. The pattern established in the conquest of the Aztec Empire would repeat across the Americas. Francisco Pizarro encountering the Inca Empire that stretched along the Andes from present-day Ecuador to Chile, a civilization that had engineered mountain roads and suspension bridges and agricultural terraces that allowed farming at impossible altitudes, that had developed quipu, a system of knotted strings that recorded information as sophisticated as any writing, that had built Machu Picchu and Cusco and dozens of other cities demonstrating architectural and engineering capabilities that the Spanish recognized as impressive even as they destroyed them. Pizarro captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa through treachery in 1532, imprisoning him and demanding a ransom of a room filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver, a ransom that was paid but that did not secure Atahualpa's release, because the Spanish killed him anyway, recognizing that he was more useful to them dead than alive, that his death would demoralize resistance, and that his life represented the possibility of rallying opposition that might threaten Spanish control. The gold and silver that filled those rooms was melted down and shipped to Spain, the artistic and cultural value destroyed to create bullion that could be weighed and counted and transported, the transformation of culture into commodity that characterized colonial extraction. But the indigenous populations did not disappear, despite European assumptions that they would, despite diseases that killed perhaps 90% of the pre-contact population across the Americas in the century after Columbus, despite the violence and the forced labor and the deliberate destruction of their political and religious systems. They survived in reduced numbers. They adapted. They resisted when they could and accommodated when they must. They preserved languages and practices and knowledge despite everything done to eliminate them. They maintained identities that the colonizers insisted did not exist or did not matter or were obstacles to the civilization being imposed. The encomienda system that Spain established in the Americas formalized the extraction, Spanish conquistadors being granted rights to indigenous labor and tribute in territories they had conquered. The system that was supposedly designed to Christianize and civilize the indigenous peoples, but that actually functioned as slavery in all but name. The forced labor that worked people to death in mines and on plantations, that took able-bodied workers from communities that needed their labor for survival, that extracted wealth through violence that was called service, and that was justified through the fiction that the indigenous peoples were being compensated through religious instruction and the benefits of Spanish rule. The debate at Valladolid in 1550 revealed the logical contortions that colonialism required. Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda arguing that indigenous peoples were natural slaves in Aristotelian terms, that their supposed inferiority justified Spanish dominance, that their human sacrifice and other practices proved they were barbarous and needed to be ruled for their own good. Bartolomé de las Casas, who had witnessed the destruction in the Caribbean and had spent decades documenting it and protesting it, argued the opposite, that indigenous peoples were fully human and possessed natural rights to their lands and their liberty, that the conquest was unjust and the violence was criminal rather than civilizing. The debate was never truly resolved, Las Casas's arguments leading to some reforms that were mostly ignored in practice, the new laws of 1542 that were supposed to protect indigenous peoples from the worst abuses, but that were resisted by colonists whose wealth depended on the forced labor being regulated, the gap between metropolitan theory and colonial practice that characterized Spanish rule, the crown claiming to protect indigenous peoples while benefiting from the silver that flowed from the mines where those peoples died by the thousands. The importation of enslaved Africans began when indigenous populations died or fled or proved insufficient for the labor demands that plantation agriculture created. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil requiring labor that could endure tropical diseases and grueling work regimes, the transatlantic slave trade that would eventually transport over 12 million Africans across the Atlantic, with millions more dying in the Middle Passage, the human beings treated as cargo, packed into ship holds in conditions designed to maximize the number transported, while accepting that a significant percentage would die during the journey. The calculation that the profits from those who survived justified the deaths of those who did not. The racial hierarchies that colonialism created were not natural or biological, but were constructed to justify the system. The theories that emerged to explain why some humans could be enslaved and others could not, why some peoples could be conquered and others were the conquerors, the pseudo-scientific racism that would develop over subsequent centuries, but that had its roots in these early colonial encounters, where Europeans needed to explain to themselves how they could claim to be Christian while treating other humans as property and as obstacles to be eliminated or subordinated. The enclosure of the commons that was happening simultaneously in Europe, the process we examined in an earlier chapter, where peasants were dispossessed of land they had used collectively for generations, found its global expression in colonial land theft, the claiming of territories through doctrines that declared that only European-style agriculture constituted legitimate land use, that hunting and gathering or nomadic herding or rotational farming systems didn't create property rights that Europeans had to respect, that vast territories could be declared available for claiming despite being inhabited by peoples who had used those lands for millennia and who had sophisticated understanding of how to live sustainably in environments that Europeans often found hostile and unproductive. The Spanish missions in California and the Southwest, the Portuguese in Brazil, the French in Canada, each developed their own versions of the civilizing mission, the religious justification for conquest that claimed to be saving souls while actually claiming land and labor, the conversion that was supposed to be voluntary, but that was enforced through violence and through the destruction of alternatives, the outlawing of indigenous religious practices, and the forced attendance at Christian services, and the separation of children from their families to be raised in missions where they would learn European ways and forget indigenous ones. The Jesuit reductions in Paraguay represented perhaps the most systematic attempt to remake indigenous societies completely. The missions where the Guarani were resettled away from their traditional territories and organized into communities governed by Jesuit priests who controlled every aspect of life, who directed labor and education and religious practice, who created what they saw as ideal Christian communities, but that functioned as total institutions where indigenous autonomy was eliminated in the name of protection and salvation. The reductions were destroyed eventually, the Jesuits expelled, but they demonstrated the colonial impulse to control and reshape, the assumption that European priests knew better than indigenous peoples how those peoples should live, the paternalism that was inseparable from the violence of colonial control. By the end of the 16th century, the pattern was established. The template that would govern colonial expansion for the next 4 centuries as European powers competed to claim territories and extract resources across the globe. The Doctrine of Discovery had provided the legal justification. The papal bulls had divided the world among Christian powers. The conquest of the Americas had demonstrated the methods, the violence necessary to impose control, and the extraction systems that would transfer wealth from colonies to metropoles, the racial theories that would justify treating some humans as less than fully human, as available for exploitation or elimination, depending on what served colonial interests. The civilizations that had existed before European contact, the political systems and the languages and the knowledge systems and the artistic traditions, these were systematically destroyed or driven underground, preserved only in fragments in the practices that people maintained secretly, or in the syncretism that blended indigenous and European elements in ways that allowed some continuity while appearing to accept the new order. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. Populations that had numbered in the tens of millions reduced to remnants, entire cultures eliminated, languages lost forever when the last speakers died, the knowledge of plants and astronomy and history and philosophy that existed in oral traditions extinguished when the knowledge keepers were killed, or when the next generation was prevented from learning because they were separated from elders, or because they were punished for speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. But the story was not only destruction, was not only loss, because alongside the violence and the extraction was resistance, the refusal to disappear that characterized indigenous responses to colonialism from the beginning. Enrique leading a rebellion in Hispaniola in the 1510s, maintaining resistance for over a decade until the Spanish agreed to negotiate. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, driving the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. The countless smaller acts of resistance, the preservation of languages despite prohibitions, the maintenance of religious practices disguised as Christian devotion, the running away and the refusal to work, and the passive resistance that made colonial control always contested, never total, always requiring violence to maintain, because consent was never achieved. The resistance would continue for centuries, adapting to new circumstances, using European weapons and horses when they could be acquired, exploiting divisions among colonial powers, maintaining autonomous communities in mountains and jungles and deserts where colonial control could not reach, the Maroon communities in Jamaica and Suriname, the Mapuche in Chile who would resist Spanish and then Chilean conquest for over 3 centuries, the Apache and Comanche in North America who would not be finally defeated until the late 19th century, the proof that the colonial project was never as complete as colonizers claimed, that power was always contested, that the colonized never accepted the subordination imposed on them even when they could not immediately overthrow it. As the 17th century began, the Spanish and Portuguese empires were established across Central and South America and the Caribbean, the extraction economies functioning, the silver flowing from Potosi and the sugar from Brazilian plantations, and the wealth accumulating in Seville and Lisbon, and from there spreading across Europe, financing wars and palaces, and the commercial revolution that would transform European economies and eventually produce the Industrial Revolution that would be built on capital accumulated through colonial extraction and enslaved labor. The Dutch and English and French were entering the competition, establishing their own colonies in North America and the Caribbean, and beginning to look toward Asia and Africa. The scramble for territory and resources that would eventually bring almost the entire world under European control. The pattern was set, the template established, the doctrine of discovery, providing the legal framework, the civilizing mission, providing the moral justification, the violence providing the method, the extraction providing the purpose. Colonialism was not primarily about spreading Christianity or civilization or development, though these were the rhetorics that justified it. Colonialism was about wealth transfer on a global scale, about reorganizing the world economy to serve European interests, about creating a system where some nations and some peoples would grow wealthy while others would be kept poor, where the poverty of the periphery was not accidental or natural, but was deliberately created because colonial powers needed colonies to remain suppliers of cheap raw materials rather than becoming competitors in manufacturing and trade. The world that would emerge from these 5 centuries of colonial expansion would be fundamentally shaped by the relationships established in these first encounters, the assumptions about who had the right to claim sovereignty and who did not, about whose lives and whose cultures mattered, and whose could be destroyed in service of profit and power, about what constituted legitimate use of land and resources, and what could be dismissed as primitive and therefore available for claiming, about the hierarchy of peoples and the superiority that supposedly justified domination. The night deepens over these first chapters of colonial history, over these encounters and conquests, and the systems of justification that were constructed to make theft seem like discovery and violence seem like civilization, over the civilizations that were destroyed and the peoples who were subjugated and the wealth that was extracted, over the resistance that began immediately and that would continue for centuries, over the template that was established in the Americas and that would be exported to Asia and Africa as European power grew and the appetite for resources and markets expanded to encompass the globe. The story continues through centuries more of extraction and resistance, through the evolution of the systems and the sophistication of the methods, through the formal end of empires and the persistence of colonial relationships in new forms, through the independence struggles and the incomplete decolonization and the contemporary legacies that shape the world we have inherited. But the foundation was laid here, in these first encounters, in the doctrines and the violence and the extraction, in the decision that some peoples could claim the world while others would have it claimed from them, in the beginning of a system that would reshape the globe and whose impacts we still live with today. The ship left the coast of West Africa with 400 human beings chained in its hold, men and women and children who had been captured in raids or sold by traders or kidnapped from villages, forced through a brutal march to the coast where European forts waited, stone structures built specifically for the business of turning human beings into cargo, processing them through the architecture of dehumanization that began before they ever saw the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic to lives of forced labor on plantations they had no part in choosing to work on. The Middle Passage was designed for efficiency measured in profits rather than in human welfare. The slaves packed into spaces so tight that lying down meant being pressed against other bodies. The air so foul from waste and disease that even the sailors refused to enter the holds. Except when necessary, the mortality rates calculated into the business model with the understanding that perhaps 15% would die during the crossing, but that the survivors would still generate returns that justified the voyage. Some ships lost more, epidemics spreading through the crowded holds, or rebellions leading to mass killings, or storms damaging ships and causing deaths through drowning or starvation. But the trade continued because the economics worked, because the demand for labor on American plantations exceeded what could be supplied by European indentured servants or by indigenous peoples who had died in massive numbers from disease and overwork. The 12 million Africans who were transported across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries were not primitive peoples being rescued from savagery, were not volunteers seeking opportunity in new lands, but were victims of a systematic business enterprise that required their dehumanization to function, that could only work if the enslaved were treated as property rather than people, as instruments of production rather than as human beings with rights and dignity and families and cultures and futures that mattered as much as anyone else's. The kingdoms and societies from which they were taken were complex and organized, some with long histories of trade and governance, some with artistic and intellectual traditions that were sophisticated by any measure. The Kingdom of Congo had diplomatic relations with Portugal, sent ambassadors to Rome, had converted to Christianity in the late 15th century, and had developed its own synthesis of Christian and traditional beliefs, had a written language using Portuguese script and administrative systems that governed a territory larger than many European states. The various states of West Africa, from which most slaves were taken, had economies based on agriculture and trade, had metalworking and textile production, had oral literary traditions, and musical forms that would survive the Middle Passage and would eventually transform American culture, even as the people who created them remained enslaved. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil were death camps disguised as agricultural enterprises. The work so brutal and the conditions so terrible that the enslaved population could not sustain itself, requiring constant importation of new slaves to replace those who died from disease and overwork and violence. The life expectancy measured in years rather than decades, the calculation being that working people to death was more profitable than providing conditions that would allow them to survive and reproduce, that new slaves could be purchased more cheaply than existing slaves could be maintained in health. The wealth generated was staggering. Sugar transforming from luxury to necessity in European diets, the sweetener that made tea and coffee and chocolate palatable to European tastes, the calories that supplemented the diets of European workers whose own conditions were grim, but who at least were not legally owned by their employers, whose labor was exploited, but who retained some rights that the enslaved were systematically denied. The profits from sugar built the great merchant houses of Liverpool and Bristol, financed the country estates where English gentlemen lived on wealth extracted from slaves they never saw, working on plantations they never visited, created the capital that would finance Britain's industrial revolution and transform it into the world's dominant economic power. The African diaspora created by the slave trade was cultural destruction on a massive scale. Languages lost or blended into creoles, religions suppressed and then preserved through syncretism that disguised African deities as Christian saints. Families separated with children sold away from parents and husbands from wives. The deliberate destruction of social bonds that might allow collective resistance, the isolation and atomization that made control easier and rebellion harder. But culture survived despite everything designed to destroy it, the music and the stories and the religious practices adapting to new circumstances, creating new forms, jazz and blues and spirituals, growing from African roots transplanted to American soil, the resilience of peoples who maintained identity and dignity despite systematic efforts to reduce them to instruments of production. The resistance was constant, the slave rebellions in Jamaica and Haiti and throughout the Americas, demonstrating that the enslaved never accepted their enslavement, that they fought for freedom whenever they saw opportunities, that the system required constant violence to maintain because consent was never achieved, and could never be achieved because freedom is not something that humans stop desiring, no matter how thoroughly the systems oppressing them claim that their oppression is natural or divinely ordained or beneficial to them. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791, was the most successful slave rebellion in history. The enslaved population of France's wealthiest colony rising up and eventually defeating French forces and establishing an independent nation, the only successful slave rebellion that resulted in a lasting independent state, the revolution that terrified slave owners across the Americas, because it proved that the enslaved could win, that the system could be overthrown, that the supposed racial hierarchies that justified slavery were lies that could be destroyed through organized resistance and military capability. But Haiti paid dearly for its freedom, France refusing to recognize independence until Haiti agreed to pay an enormous indemnity, compensation to former slave owners for their lost property, the enslaved who had freed themselves being forced to pay their former owners for the crime of claiming the liberty that should have been theirs from birth, the debt that would burden Haiti for over a century and would contribute to the poverty that persists today, the economic warfare that punished successful resistance to ensure that other colonies would not follow Haiti's example. Across the Atlantic and India, a different kind of extraction was transforming one of the world's wealthiest regions into a supplier of raw materials for British industry. The deindustrialization that was deliberate policy rather than natural economic evolution. The destruction of Indian textile manufacturing that had supplied markets across Asia and Europe for centuries, producing fabrics that were superior to anything Europe manufactured and that were competitive on price despite the transportation costs from India to European markets. The British East India Company, which had begun as a trading concern, transformed itself through military conquest and political manipulation into the de facto government of large parts of India by the mid-18th century, using its control to reshape the economy to serve British interests. The company imposed tariffs that made Indian textiles expensive in British markets, while British goods entered India duty-free, destroyed looms and cut off the thumbs of weavers in regions that resisted the new order, transformed India from manufacturer to supplier of raw cotton that would be shipped to Manchester, where it would be processed in British mills using British labor, and then sold back to India as finished cloth. The value added in Britain and the profits accumulated there, while Indian weavers who had been skilled artisans found themselves unemployed or reduced to agricultural labor. The famines that killed tens of millions of Indians over the 2 centuries of British rule were not natural disasters, but were created or exacerbated by colonial policies that prioritized extraction over welfare, that maintained exports of grain from regions where people were starving, because the contracts with British merchants had to be honored, and because relieving famine was less important to colonial administrators than maintaining the revenue flows that justified their rule to authorities in London. The Victorian Holocausts, as historian Mike Davis termed them, killed more people than the Atlantic slave trade, death tolls that were rarely acknowledged in British histories that celebrated empire as a civilizing force bringing progress and development to backward regions that were actually being systematically impoverished by the very policies presented as improvement. The silver mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia demonstrated extraction at its most brutal, the mountain that was literally torn apart over 3 centuries of mining, the silver extracted through forced labor systems that killed indigenous workers by the thousands, the Mita system that required indigenous communities to provide workers who would labor in conditions so terrible that many died within months, the wealth flowing to Spain and from there across Europe, financing the wars and the courts and the cathedrals that Spanish silver made possible, while the people who mined it lived in poverty and died young. The environmental destruction was as total as the human cost, forests stripped to provide fuel for smelting, rivers poisoned by mercury used in silver processing, landscapes transformed into wastelands, the externalities of extraction borne by colonized peoples, while the benefits accumulated in metropoles that were insulated from the costs their wealth required. This pattern would repeat across the colonial world: rubber plantations in the Congo and tin mines in Bolivia and gold mines in South Africa, each extracting resources through labor that was forced or coerced or paid wages so minimal that the difference from slavery was technical rather than practical. The wealth accumulated through colonialism and slavery was not just enjoyed by a small elite, but was foundational to European development. The capital that financed industrialization, the markets that absorbed manufactured goods, the raw materials that fed the factories, all provided by colonial systems that were organized to serve metropolitan interests, while subordinating colonial populations to permanent roles as suppliers of cheap resources and consumers of expensive European manufactures. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain and later other European nations was built on this foundation. The factories powered by coal, but financed by profits from sugar and cotton. The workers whose labor was exploited in Manchester, connected through global chains of exploitation to the slaves whose labor was stolen on Caribbean plantations, and to the Indian farmers whose industries were deliberately destroyed to create markets for British goods. Adam Smith, writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776, was celebrating an economic system that was fundamentally dependent on colonialism, even as he analyzed it in terms that suggested it was natural and beneficial, the invisible hand that supposedly guided markets toward optimal outcomes, functioning through very visible chains that bound slaves and through very deliberate policies that destroyed colonial industries to benefit metropolitan ones. The free trade that Smith advocated was practiced selectively. Britain destroying Indian manufacturing through protectionism, while demanding that India accept British imports without tariffs. The rules applied differently depending on whether you were metropole or colony, the freedom extending only to those with power, while those without power faced coercion disguised as economic rationality. The abolition of slavery, when it finally came in the 19th century, was partial victory at best. The British abolishing the owners for their lost property while providing nothing to the enslaved who had created the wealth that the owners claimed. The formerly enslaved entering freedom without land or capital or education or reparations, expected to compete in economies structured to disadvantage them, while their former owners received compensation that allowed them to invest in new enterprises. The indentured labor systems that replaced slavery in many colonies were slavery by another name. Indians and Chinese transported to plantations in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia and Africa under contracts that were theoretically voluntary, but that were enforced through conditions that made escape impossible, and that often extended through mechanisms of debt that bound workers and sometimes their children to plantations for years or decades. The freedom that was supposed to replace slavery, proving to be freedom in name only for those who had no alternatives and no power to negotiate contracts that were presented as choices, but that were actually coercion disguised as agreement. The colonial economy that had been constructed over centuries created dependency that would outlast formal colonialism. The colonies that had been prevented from industrializing found themselves unable to compete with European manufacturers even after independence. The economies that had been organized around exporting raw materials lacked the infrastructure and the capital and the technology to transform those raw materials into finished goods. The trade relationships that had enriched metropoles while impoverishing colonies persisted even after the political relationships changed. The neo-colonialism that would preserve extraction under new names and new mechanisms. But throughout these centuries of extraction and exploitation, the resistance continued. The Maroon communities in Jamaica and Suriname maintaining their freedom for generations, the indigenous peoples who preserved their languages and cultures despite prohibitions, the slaves who ran away or slowed their work or destroyed property or rebelled when opportunities arose, the subtle and not so subtle refusal to accept the subordination imposed on them, the proof that power was always contested even when the contest seemed hopeless. The wealth gaps that exist today between the global North and South are not natural or the result of different cultures or work ethics or climates, but are the direct result of centuries of colonial policies that were designed to enrich some nations by impoverishing others, that transferred wealth on a scale unprecedented in human history, that created the conditions where some nations industrialized while others were prevented from industrializing, where some accumulated capital while others accumulated debt, where some developed while others were deliberately underdeveloped because the colonial system required this inequality to function. The engines of empire ran on human suffering and environmental destruction, on the breaking of bodies and cultures and ecosystems, on the transformation of people into property and of complex societies into suppliers of raw materials, on the justification of theft through theories of racial superiority and civilizing missions that were always pretexts for economic extraction. The wealth that these engines generated built the infrastructure and the institutions and the industrial base that made Europe and later North America rich, while the regions that supplied the resources and the labor remained poor, not through failure, but through the success of colonial policies that were working exactly as designed. The night settles over this history of extraction and resistance, over these millions of lives stolen, and these societies transformed and this wealth transferred, over the ships and the mines and the plantations, over the systems that were built to serve some by subordinating others, over the economic relationships that would outlast the political structures that created them. The story continues through the scramble for Africa and the world wars and the independence struggles, through the formal end of empires and the persistence of extraction, through the contemporary legacies that shape the world we have inherited, where the wealth and the poverty are not accidents, but are the results of deliberate policies that were implemented over centuries and whose impacts persist in structures that outlived the empires that created them. The children were taken in the early morning, government agents and missionaries arriving at indigenous communities with lists of names and the legal authority to remove children from their families, to transport them to schools that were hundreds of miles away, to places where they would not see their parents for months or years, where they would be forbidden to speak their languages or practice their religions or maintain any connection to the cultures they had been born into. The justification was improvement, the claim that indigenous children needed to be saved from the savagery of their own peoples, that education in European ways was a gift rather than a theft, that the destruction of indigenous identity was actually rescue, that killing the Indian to save the child, as the American reformer Richard Pratt proclaimed, was humanitarian work rather than cultural genocide. The residential schools that operated across Canada and the United States and Australia were laboratories of assimilation, total institutions designed to transform Indigenous children into imitation Europeans, to strip away everything that made them Indigenous and replace it with Christianity and English and the work habits and values that would make them useful laborers in the colonial economy, while preventing them from maintaining the collective identities and land claims that threatened colonial control. The children arrive speaking Cree or Navajo or Aboriginal languages, left speaking English or French if they survived the experience, if they did not die from disease or malnutrition or abuse, if they did not run away and freeze in the attempt to return to families who did not know where they had been taken. The schools were not secrets, were not aberrations that colonizers later discovered and condemned, but were official policy celebrated as progressive, as evidence of the humanitarian concern that supposedly motivated colonial rule, as proof that the empire was uplifting backward peoples rather than destroying their societies for profit. The churches ran many of the schools with government funding and oversight, Catholic and Protestant denominations competing for the opportunity to save souls while breaking spirits, the religious justification making the violence seem like love, the systematic destruction of cultures presented as rescue of children from darkness into light. But the light was violence, the love was abuse, the salvation was trauma that would mark generations. The children were beaten for speaking their languages, their mouths washed with soap for words their mothers had taught them, their bodies punished for resisting the transformation that was being imposed on them. They were housed in overcrowded dormitories where disease spread easily and medical care was minimal, fed inadequate diets that left them hungry and vulnerable to tuberculosis and other infections, worked in conditions that violated the labor laws that protected white children, the farm work and the laundry and the maintenance of the schools themselves performed by children who were supposedly being educated, but who were actually providing the labor that made the institutions financially viable. The sexual abuse was systematic at many institutions, the children vulnerable to predators who had absolute authority over them, and who knew that Indigenous children's testimony would not be believed or valued by authorities who had placed them there. The trauma compounded by the inability to tell parents who might be thousands of miles away, and who might not be told if their children died, who might receive notification months later that their child had succumbed to illness or accident. The bodies often buried at the schools rather than returned home, the graves unmarked or poorly marked, the children disappearing into institutions that were presented as schools, but that functioned as prisons from which escape was difficult, and from which death was not uncommon. The psychological damage was perhaps worse than the physical. The children taught to hate themselves and their families and their peoples, told that everything indigenous was savage and dirty and evil, that their parents were primitive and incapable of raising them properly, that their languages were worthless and their religions were devil worship, the internalization of colonizers' contempt creating shame that would persist for lifetimes. The survivors, often unable to parent their own children, because they had been prevented from learning how families functioned, had been removed during the years when they would have learned their culture's ways of raising children, emerging from the schools traumatized and disconnected from the communities they had been taken from, and unable to fully join the white society that would never accept them as equals. The intergenerational trauma that residential schools created persists today. The survivors and their children and their grandchildren carrying the impact, the missionaries who preceded or accompanied colonial conquest saw their work as saving souls, bringing Christianity to peoples who practiced traditional religions that the missionaries condemned as paganism or devil worship. Never mind that these religions had sophisticated theologies and ethical systems and had served their communities for centuries or millennia, that they were intimately connected to the land and the ecology and the social organization of the peoples who practiced them. The missionaries demanded conversion, built churches on sacred sites, destroyed religious objects and prohibited ceremonies, criminalized practices that competed with Christianity, created the conditions where indigenous peoples had to at least perform Christianity to avoid punishment, even when they maintained traditional beliefs secretly, or blended the two in syncretistic forms that preserved elements of indigenous religion disguised as Christian devotion. The legal systems that colonizers imposed criminalized indigenous practices while normalizing European ones. The laws against potlatch ceremonies among Pacific Northwest peoples that prohibited the gift-giving practices that redistributed wealth and maintained social bonds, the laws against sun dances and other religious ceremonies, the laws that made it illegal for indigenous peoples in some colonies to leave their reserves without permission, or to hire lawyers to pursue land claims, or to organize politically. The colonial legal systems created different categories of legal personhood with different rights depending on race. The indigenous peoples who were wards of the state rather than citizens, who were subject to laws that did not apply to whites, and who could not vote or own property in the same ways, who were governed by bureaucrats, who had absolute authority over their lives, and who could make decisions about where they lived and how they used their land and whether their children would be taken to residential schools. The theft of land was justified through legal fictions that declared that only European-style agriculture constituted proper land use, that nomadic peoples, or those who practiced hunting and gathering or rotational agriculture, did not have property rights that Europeans had to respect, that vast territories could be declared terra nullius, empty land, despite being inhabited by peoples who had lived there for thousands of years and who had sophisticated knowledge of how to use those lands sustainably. Australia was settled on the legal fiction that it was empty despite having been inhabited for at least 65,000 years by Aboriginal peoples who had developed complex societies and knowledge systems that allowed them to thrive in environments that Europeans found harsh and unproductive. The Doctrine of Discovery that we examined in the first chapter found its expression in property law that gave Europeans the right to claim land they discovered even when that land was inhabited, the claiming giving them superior title that extinguished indigenous rights or reduced them to rights of occupancy that could be terminated at colonial government's discretion. The treaties that were signed were often negotiated in bad faith, the promises made deliberately vague or contradictory, the translations misleading or incomplete, the understanding of what was being agreed to different for the indigenous signatories who thought they were sharing land use rights and the colonial governments who believed they were purchasing absolute ownership. The violation of treaties was systematic, the agreements broken when honoring them became inconvenient, when resources were discovered on land that had been supposedly guaranteed to indigenous peoples, when colonial populations wanted to expand into territories that treaties had protected. The legal systems that enforced contracts between Europeans had no mechanism to enforce treaties with indigenous peoples, or rather, they had the mechanism but not the will, the courts recognizing that treaties were legally binding, but ruling that governments had the authority to violate them, that indigenous peoples could seek compensation but not enforcement, that money could substitute for land even when the land had spiritual and cultural significance that could not be compensated through cash payments. The cultural exhibitions and world's fairs where colonized peoples were displayed demonstrated the dehumanization that made the civilizing mission psychologically possible for those who implemented it. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis included a Philippine village where Filipinos were exhibited as examples of primitive peoples. The displays arranged to show evolutionary progression from savagery to civilization, with whites at the apex and colonized peoples at earlier stages. The human zoos that operated across Europe and America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries displayed Africans and indigenous peoples from the Americas and the Pacific alongside exotic animals. The humans in recreated native villages performing for crowds who paid admission to see what savages looked like. The exhibited peoples sometimes kidnapped and sometimes recruited through deception and always exploited. Ota Benga, a Congolese man, was displayed in the monkey house at the Bronx Zoo in 1906. The degradation so extreme that even contemporaries who accepted racial hierarchies were disturbed. But the protests were about the propriety of the exhibition rather than about the racism that made it conceivable, the assumption that some humans were so different from Europeans that they could be appropriately displayed alongside primates going largely unchallenged. The scientific racism that justified these exhibitions was developed by European and American scientists who measured skulls and declared that the measurements proved European superiority, who studied brain sizes and skin colors and facial features and created elaborate classifications that placed peoples in hierarchies that coincidentally put white Europeans at the top and the colonized peoples at the bottom. The theories were nonsense, the measurements were manipulated or selectively reported, the conclusions were predetermined, and the evidence was gathered to support them rather than to test them. But they were treated as science and were taught in universities and were used to justify colonial domination and immigration restrictions and eugenic policies that forcibly sterilized those deemed inferior. The racism was not just ideology, but was embedded in institutions, in laws that prohibited intermarriage or that restricted where people could live based on race, in employment practices that reserved skilled jobs for whites, in education systems that taught white children that they were superior, and taught colonized children that they were inferior and should accept subordination as natural. The environmental knowledge that indigenous peoples had developed over millennia was dismissed as primitive superstition by colonizers who often understood far less about the landscapes they were claiming, the sustainable practices that had allowed indigenous peoples to live in balance with their environments, replaced by extractive practices that depleted soils and destroyed forests and drove species to extinction. The passenger pigeon, once the most numerous bird in North America, with populations in the billions, was hunted to extinction by the early 20th century, the last one dying in captivity in 1914. The destruction enabled by the elimination of indigenous peoples who had hunted sustainably, and their replacement by colonizers who treated wildlife as inexhaustible commodity. The colonial forestry and agricultural policies often failed because they ignored indigenous knowledge. The attempts to impose European farming methods in African colonies, sometimes leading to soil exhaustion and erosion, because the methods were not adapted to tropical conditions. The colonial authorities dismissing indigenous agricultural practices as backward even when those practices were more sustainable than the European alternatives being imposed. The famines that resulted were blamed on indigenous laziness or ignorance rather than on the colonial policies that had disrupted working systems and replaced them with methods that did not function in local conditions. But the civilizing mission claimed to be bringing progress, bringing education and health care and modern agriculture and rational government to peoples who supposedly lacked these things. The narrative that allowed colonizers to see themselves as benefactors rather than as exploiters, that made the violence seem regrettable but necessary, that justified the destruction of cultures as rescue of individuals from backwardness. The schools that taught indigenous children to be ashamed of their parents, the hospitals that provided medicine while demanding that traditional healing practices be abandoned, the agricultural extension services that taught European farming methods while prohibiting indigenous ones, all were presented as gifts that the colonized should be grateful for, rather than as impositions that destroyed working systems and replaced them with ones that served colonial interests. The infrastructure that colonialism built, the railways and the ports and the roads, was designed for extraction rather than for development. The transportation networks connecting mines and plantations to ports where resources could be shipped to metropoles, rather than connecting communities to each other or to markets where they might have developed local economies. The hospitals and schools that colonizers built primarily served white settlers and colonial administrators, with indigenous peoples having limited access and receiving inferior services when they were served at all. The improvements that colonialism claimed to bring were real in some cases, but were always subordinated to the primary purpose of extraction and control. The welfare of colonized peoples never the priority except when it served colonial interests. The resistance to the civilizing mission was constant and took forms that ranged from armed rebellion to everyday refusal to cooperate, from the preservation of languages and practices despite prohibitions, to the adaptation of colonial tools and technologies for purposes that served indigenous interests rather than colonial ones. The indigenous students who maintained their languages secretly despite being punished for speaking them, the parents who taught their children traditional ways, even as those children attended schools designed to make them forget, the communities that preserved ceremonies and knowledge systems by practicing them away from colonial surveillance, All were resisting cultural genocide through the ordinary heroism of refusing to let their cultures die even when everything in the colonial system was designed to kill them. The civilizing mission was violence disguised as improvement, the destruction of cultures presented as their salvation, the subordination of peoples justified through claims that it was for their own good, that they would thank their colonizers eventually when they understood what gifts they had been given. But the colonized peoples never stopped understanding that what was being taken was more valuable than what was being offered, that their languages and cultures and ways of knowing and governing themselves were not inferior to European alternatives, but were simply different and were perfectly adequate to their purposes, until colonialism destroyed the conditions in which they could function. The legacy of the civilizing mission persists in the internalized racism that makes some people from formerly colonized societies believe European culture is superior to their own, in the loss of languages and the interruption of cultural transmission, in the trauma that residential school survivors and their descendants carry, in the stolen generations of Aboriginal Australians who were removed from their families, in the continuing assumption that development means becoming more like Europe or America, rather than developing according to values and priorities that emerge from local cultures and conditions. The night deepens over this history of cultural destruction, masked as improvement, over these children stolen, and these languages lost, and these ways of knowing dismissed and destroyed, over the violence that was called education, and the theft that was called development, and the genocide that was called civilization. The pattern continues through the scramble for Africa and the completion of colonial conquest, through the world wars and the independence struggles, through the formal end of empires and the persistence of assumptions about whose knowledge and whose cultures matter, through the contemporary legacies that shape how we think about development and progress, and whose voices are heard when decisions are made about futures that belong to everyone. The map that Otto von Bismarck spread across the conference table in Berlin in November 1884 showed a continent that European powers had been probing for centuries but had not yet claimed completely. The interior of Africa still marked with blank spaces on European maps, even as African kingdoms and empires and trading networks had mapped these territories through knowledge passed down over generations, through trade routes and political relationships and cultural connections that Europeans had barely begun to understand. The conference that Bismarck convened was not attended by a single African representative. Not one person from the continent being divided was present to object or to assert sovereignty over territories that had never been ceded, the assumption being so complete that African peoples had no say in their own governance, that inviting them did not even occur to the European powers gathering to carve up a continent. The rules established at Berlin were designed to prevent conflict among European powers by creating procedures for claiming African territories, the requirement being that claims had to be backed by effective occupation rather than by mere discovery, that treaties with indigenous rulers had to be produced, that other European powers had to be notified of claims so that competing claims could be negotiated rather than fought over. The Berlin Act was not about African welfare or about establishing legitimate governance, but was about managing European competition, about ensuring that the scramble for territory did not lead to war among the colonizers, the interests of colonized peoples not factored into calculations except as obstacles to be overcome or as labor to be exploited. The speed of the conquest was extraordinary. In 1880, only about 10% of Africa was under formal European control, most of that in the north and south. The vast interior still governed by African political systems that had existed for centuries. By 1914, over 90% of the continent had been claimed by European powers. The map painted in the colors of empire, pink for British territories, purple for French, red for German, orange for Portuguese. The straight lines drawn with rulers cutting through kingdoms and dividing peoples who shared languages and cultures, while forcing together groups who had been separate or even hostile. The borders designed for European administrative convenience without regard for African political realities. The violence required to impose this control was systematic and total, the resistance fierce, because African peoples understood exactly what was being taken and what colonial rule would mean for their sovereignty and their futures. The British faced resistance in Sudan, where the Mahdist forces fought for over a decade. In Zimbabwe, where the Ndebele and Shona rose in coordinated rebellion in 1896. In countless smaller engagements, where African armies fought European forces that had superior weapons, but that were often outnumbered, and that succeeded through technology and through tactics that were ruthless even by the standards of the era. The Maxim gun changed colonial warfare, the early machine gun that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, the weapon that allowed small European forces to defeat much larger African armies, the technology that made the conquest possible and that was celebrated in Hilaire Belloc's grotesque poem. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. The battles were massacres disguised as military victories, African forces armed with spears and sometimes with older firearms facing weapons that could kill at rates that made resistance suicidal, but that Africans attempted anyway because the alternative was accepting subordination that they understood would destroy their societies. King Leopold II of Belgium created a private colony in the Congo through deception and violence that shocked even contemporaries who had accepted other colonial brutalities. The Congo Free State, that was neither free nor properly a state, but was Leopold's personal property, a territory larger than Western Europe, that he claimed through treaties that were fraudulent, that promised protection and partnership, but that delivered slavery and systematic extraction. The rubber boom of the 1890s turned the Congo into a death camp. The global demand for rubber for bicycle and automobile tires creating incentives for extraction that led to forced labor systems that killed millions. The quotas imposed on villages that had to provide rubber or face punishments that included amputation of hands, the taking of hostages to ensure compliance, the burning of villages that resisted. The photographs that emerged from the Congo, images of children with amputated hands and of emaciated survivors, and of white overseers posing with severed heads, created international scandal that eventually forced Leopold to cede the colony to the Belgian state. But the system continued in modified form, the forced labor persisting even after the publicity had shamed Belgium into claiming to reform. The death toll will never be known precisely, estimates ranging from 5 to 15 million. the population declining by perhaps half during Leopold's reign, the human cost of rubber extraction creating wealth for European investors, and misery for Congolese peoples who had not asked for their land to be claimed or for their labor to be stolen. In German Southwest Africa, the Herero and Nama peoples rose in rebellion in 1904 against German colonial rule that had seized their land and their cattle. The resistance met with genocide that was deliberate and systematic. General Lothar von Trotha issuing an extermination order that declared that all Herero found within German territory would be shot, that women and children would be driven into the desert to die of thirst. The policy that killed perhaps 80% of the Herero population and half of the Nama. The survivors were placed in concentration camps where they were used as forced labor and where many more died from disease and malnutrition and abuse. The camps serving as models that would later inform Nazi policies. The colonial laboratory where techniques of genocide were developed that would later be applied in Europe. The British built concentration camps during the Boer War in South Africa, interning Afrikaner women and children and black Africans in camps where over 20,000 died from disease and malnutrition. The policy designed to break Boer resistance by destroying their families and their farms. The violence that was barely mentioned in British celebrations of victory. The camps whose very existence was denied or minimized by authorities who claimed that British imperialism was more humane than other varieties. The pattern repeated across French territories in Algeria and West Africa, across Portuguese territories in Angola and Mozambique, the forced labor and the brutal suppression of resistance, and the extraction that prioritized European profit over African welfare. But the colonial order that seemed so total was disrupted by events in Europe that would reveal its fragility and would begin the long process of its undoing. The First World War drew hundreds of thousands of colonized peoples into European conflicts. The soldiers from India and Africa and the Caribbean, who fought in trenches and in campaigns across Africa and the Middle East, who were promised that their service would be rewarded with reform or autonomy, or at least with recognition of their contributions, who saw European powers that claimed superiority destroying each other through industrial warfare that killed millions and that undermined claims that Europeans were more civilized or rational than the peoples they colonized. The return of colonial soldiers who had fought for empires that then refused to honor promises of reform created the conditions for new resistance. The veterans who had learned European military tactics and who had seen European weakness and who came home to colonies where nothing had changed except that their expectations had been raised and then disappointed. The Pan-African Congress, organized by W.E.B. Du Bois in Paris in 1919, demanded that the League of Nations address colonial rule. The principle of self-determination that Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed applied only to European territories divided after the war, not to the colonies that had contributed so much to Allied victory. The racism so complete that the possibility of African or Asian self-governance was not even seriously considered by the peace conference architects. But movements were growing. The Indian National Congress, that had been founded in 1885 as a loyal organization, petitioning for reforms within the British system, transformed by leaders like Gandhi into a mass movement demanding complete independence. the strategy of non-violent resistance that made British violence visible and that denied Britain the excuse of responding to violence with violence, the Salt March of 1930, where Gandhi walked to the sea to make salt in defiance of British monopoly, the simple, powerful gesture that mobilized millions and that demonstrated that colonial law was unjust and that unjust laws could be defied. In Africa, the formation of the African National Congress in South Africa in 1912, the development of nationalist movements across French West Africa, the Pan-Africanist ideas promoted by intellectuals like Marcus Garvey, who argued that Africans worldwide shared common interests and should unite against colonial oppression, the stirrings of consciousness that would eventually coalesce into the independence movements that would dismantle formal empire. The interwar period saw these movements grow, but also saw colonial powers dig in. The French and British and Portuguese convinced that their empires were permanent, that the colonized peoples were not ready for self-governance and would not be ready for generations. The paternalism that justified continued rule, even as it grew increasingly difficult to sustain. The Second World War disrupted colonial order even more profoundly than the first. The spectacle of European powers again destroying each other. The Japanese conquests in Asia that shattered the myth of white supremacy by demonstrating that Asian powers could defeat European ones. The Atlantic Charter that proclaimed the right of all peoples to choose their own government, even though Churchill insisted it applied only to territories under Nazi occupation and not to British colonies. The contradiction so glaring that it could not be sustained. The return of soldiers from Burma and North Africa and Europe, the hundreds of thousands of Indians and Africans and Caribbeans who had fought for freedom in Europe while being denied it at home, created expectations that could not be suppressed. The colonial powers were exhausted and bankrupt. The war had drained their treasuries and their will, and the new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both claimed to oppose colonialism even as their motives were self-interested. The Americans wanting access to markets that European empires restricted, the Soviets wanting allies in the Cold War competition, the independence movements that had been building for decades accelerated into overwhelming forces. The Congress Party in India organizing mass campaigns that made the country ungovernable, the costs of maintaining control exceeding the benefits, Britain granting independence in 1947 to India and Pakistan in a partition that killed perhaps 1 million people and displaced millions more, the borders drawn hastily by British lawyers dividing communities and creating the conditions for conflicts that persist today. In Indonesia, the Dutch attempted to reimpose colonial rule after Japanese occupation, facing resistance from nationalists led by Sukarno, who declared independence and fought a 4-year war before the Dutch finally withdrew in 1949. The recognition that holding colonies against determined resistance was impossible in the new international climate. But independence came slowly and often violently to territories where European settlers had claimed land and where colonial powers believed their interests were too vital to abandon. In Algeria, the French faced a revolution that began in 1954 and would last 8 years, killing hundreds of thousands, the French army using torture and collective punishment and detention camps to suppress the FLN, the independence movement that used guerrilla tactics and that eventually won not through military victory, but through making continued French rule politically untenable, the violence revealing that France's civilizing mission had always been built on violence, and that when the mask dropped, the brutality was naked and undeniable. In Kenya, the British faced the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, responding with a campaign of terror that included detention camps where torture was systematic, the screening of populations to identify rebels, the collective punishment of communities suspected of supporting resistance, the violence that killed thousands and that detained hundreds of thousands more, the British insisting they were maintaining order while actually suppressing legitimate demands for independence from peoples whose land had been stolen and who had been relegated to inferior status in their own country. The revelations of torture and abuse that emerged from Kenya demonstrated that British colonialism, which had claimed to be more humane than other varieties, was capable of the same brutalities when its interests were threatened. The independence that came to African colonies in the 1960s, the year 1960 alone seeing 17 African nations achieve independence, was celebrated in ceremonies where colonial governors handed over authority to African leaders, where flags were lowered and raised, and where crowds celebrated freedom that had been denied for generations. But the celebrations were complicated by the knowledge that independence was incomplete, that the economies remained structured around exporting raw materials, that the borders were arbitrary, that the political systems had been designed for extraction rather than for governance, that the debts and the dependencies would persist even as the formal political relationships ended. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo spoke truth at the independence ceremony in June 1960, reminding King Baudouin and the assembled dignitaries that Congolese independence had been won through struggle, that Africans had been treated as inferior beings, that they had known forced labor and exploitation, that independence was not a gift from Belgium, but was a right that had been claimed through sacrifice. Within months, Lumumba would be overthrown in a coup supported by Belgium and the United States, murdered because his vision of genuine independence threatened Western access to Congolese resources. His death demonstrating that political independence would not be permitted to become economic independence, that neo-colonialism would preserve extraction under new forms. The Portuguese, who had been colonizing longer than any other European power, held on longest, refusing to grant independence to Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau until the 1970s, fighting brutal wars against independence movements that eventually succeeded not because Portugal was defeated militarily, but because the wars became unsustainable politically, the costs in lives and treasure eventually bringing down Portugal's own dictatorship in 1974, the empire collapsing finally and completely, the last major European power admitting that the age of formal colonialism was over. But independence came on terms that preserved many colonial relationships. The former colonies remained economically dependent on former colonizers, their currencies often tied to European currencies, their exports often going to former colonial powers, their imports often coming from the same sources, the trade relationships that had enriched metropoles at colonial expense, continuing even after flags changed, even after African and Asian leaders replaced European governors, the structure persisting even as the political forms changed. The neo-colonialism that would define the post-independence era, and that would demonstrate that decolonization was incomplete. The night deepens over these struggles for independence, over these wars and movements and the leaders who emerged to challenge colonial rule, over the promises made and broken, over the violence of suppression and the violence of liberation, over the celebrations that were genuine but that were also bittersweet because independence was partial and the work of decolonization was unfinished. The story continues through the Cold War interventions and the structural adjustment and the continuation of extraction under new names, through the contemporary legacies that shape the world we have inherited, where the formal empires are gone, but where the relationships of domination and extraction persist in forms that are less visible, but no less real. The photograph from the independence ceremony in Ghana on March 6, 1957, shows Kwame Nkrumah standing before enormous crowds, the new flag of independent Ghana rising as the Union Jack descended for the final time, the moment that seemed to mark the end of colonial rule in Africa and the beginning of something genuinely new. The African leaders finally governing their own nations after generations of European domination, the freedom that had been fought for and that had finally been achieved. But Nkrumah understood something that the celebratory crowds could not yet see, that political independence without economic independence was incomplete, that the structures of colonial extraction would persist under new forms, that what he would call neo-colonialism was already being constructed, even as the formal empires were being dismantled. He warned about this in speeches and writings that were prophetic in their accuracy, describing how former colonial powers would maintain control through economic means rather than through direct political rule, through debt and through control of export markets, and through the continuation of extraction by corporations that would take resources while leaving poverty, through the installation or support of leaders who would serve foreign interests rather than their own people's needs, through military interventions when economic control proved insufficient. The warning was ignored or dismissed by those who believed that independence meant genuine sovereignty, who thought that once the Europeans left, African nations would be free to develop according to their own priorities and values. But the borders that the new nations inherited made genuine sovereignty nearly impossible, the lines drawn by colonial administrators at Berlin and in subsequent agreements dividing ethnic groups and forcing together peoples who had been separate or hostile, creating nation-states that had no organic unity, that were held together only by the colonial administrative structures that independence governments inherited. The Somali people found themselves divided among 5 different countries, their kinship networks and pastoral migration routes cut by borders that made no sense for their way of life, but that served colonial administrative convenience. The Yoruba were split between Nigeria and Benin, the Yu between Ghana and Togo. The divisions arbitrary from African perspectives, but permanent, because the Organization of African Unity agreed that colonial borders would be maintained to prevent the chaos that redrawing them would create. The economic structures were even more constraining than the borders. The colonies that had been prevented from industrializing during the colonial period found themselves unable to compete with former colonizers in manufacturing, their economies organized around exporting raw materials, copper from Zambia and cocoa from Ghana and coffee from Kenya and oil from Nigeria. The same extractive pattern that had enriched Europe during colonialism, continuing after independence, with the difference being that African governments now received royalties and taxes that were still only a fraction of the value created, that left the wealth flowing outward while poverty remained. The terms of trade worked against raw material exporters, the prices for agricultural commodities and minerals fluctuating wildly, while the prices for manufactured goods that had to be imported remained high or increased. The scissors effect, where what you sold became cheaper over time, while what you bought became more expensive. The structural inequality that meant working harder produced less benefit, that trapped former colonies in permanent subordination, disguised as free trade. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions created ostensibly to promote development, became mechanisms for imposing conditions that preserved colonial economic relationships. The loans that came with requirements to privatize state enterprises and to open markets to foreign competition and to cut government spending on health and education and subsidies that made food affordable. The structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s were neo-colonialism's most visible form. The debt crisis that began when interest rates rose and commodity prices fell, leaving dozens of countries unable to service debts that had been incurred sometimes by corrupt leaders, and sometimes for development projects that failed, and sometimes simply through the accumulation of trade deficits that structural inequality made inevitable. The IMF demanded reforms as conditions for new loans that would allow countries to continue paying old debts, the reforms requiring the dismantling of the developmental state, the selling of public utilities to foreign corporations, the elimination of capital controls that might have protected domestic industries, the subordination of economic policy to the preferences of foreign creditors rather than to the needs of domestic populations. The results were catastrophic for many countries. The privatization of water systems in Bolivia, leading to rate increases that sparked rebellions. The structural adjustment in Zambia, destroying what little industry had been built. The across-the-board implementation of policies that were presented as technical economic management, but that were actually political choices benefiting foreign creditors and corporations at the expense of populations that had no say in the decisions being made about their futures. The colonial pattern of external control continued, the difference being that now it operated through debt and conditional loans rather than through direct political rule, that the violence was economic rather than military, though military intervention remained available when economic coercion proved insufficient. The coups and interventions that removed leaders who attempted genuine economic independence demonstrated the limits of sovereignty. Lumumba murdered in the Congo within months of independence. Nkrumah overthrown in Ghana while visiting China in 1966. Thomas Sankara killed in Burkina Faso in 1987 after attempting to break dependency on foreign aid and foreign debt. The pattern repeated across the formerly colonized world. Leaders who challenged neo-colonial relationships removed through coups that were supported or organized by former colonial powers or by the United States, replaced with leaders who would be more cooperative with foreign interests, who would maintain the extractive relationships that independence was supposed to have ended. The resource curse demonstrated how colonial structures persisted, the countries with the most valuable resources often experiencing the worst outcomes, the oil and minerals attracting foreign corporations and corrupt leaders who would collaborate with them, the wealth extracted while populations remained poor, the revenues captured by elites rather than invested in development, the Dutch disease where resource exports made other industries uncompetitive, the dependency deepening even as the resources flowed outward. Nigeria, with its vast oil reserves, experienced grinding poverty for most of its population, while elites and foreign corporations captured the wealth, the pattern repeating in the Democratic Republic of Congo with its minerals, and in Angola with its oil and diamonds, the curse being not the resources themselves, but the structures of extraction that colonialism had established and that independence had not fundamentally altered. But the legacies were not only economic. The cultural and psychological impacts of colonialism persisted in the internalized hierarchies that made some people from formerly colonized societies believe European languages and cultures were superior to their own. That development meant becoming more like the West, rather than developing according to values and priorities emerging from their own traditions. The languages imposed by colonizers became official languages of independent nations, French in much of West Africa, and English in East Africa, and Portuguese in Lusophone Africa. The use of colonial languages in government and education, marginalizing those who spoke only indigenous languages, creating hierarchies within post-colonial societies that reproduced colonial hierarchies between colonizers and colonized. The education systems inherited from colonialism continued to teach histories that centered Europe, that presented African and Asian histories as footnotes to European narratives, that measured achievement by European standards, that created what some scholars called epistemic violence, the invalidation of non-European ways of knowing, and the privileging of European knowledge systems as universal rather than as particular perspectives that had been imposed through colonial power. The decolonization of the mind that writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o called for required more than political independence, required a conscious effort to reclaim languages and histories and ways of knowing that colonialism had suppressed, to value indigenous knowledge systems not as primitive antecedents to Western science, but as sophisticated and valid approaches to understanding and engaging with the world. The environmental legacies of colonialism shaped contemporary crises, the plantation monocultures that had replaced diverse agriculture during colonialism, making former colonies vulnerable to crop failures and market fluctuations, the deforestation and soil depletion from extractive practices leaving damaged ecosystems, the mines and wells and plantations abandoned by colonial corporations, leaving pollution that communities lacked resources to clean up. The climate crisis itself bore the fingerprints of colonialism, the industrial revolution that had been financed by colonial extraction, producing the carbon emissions that were warming the planet, while the countries that had been colonized and had contributed least to emissions bore disproportionate impacts, the droughts and floods and rising seas affecting most severely the regions that had been most exploited during colonialism. The question of reparations emerged from the recognition that independence had not addressed the material consequences of centuries of extraction, that apologies without restitution rang hollow, when the wealth gaps between former colonizers and colonized were direct results of colonial policies, that justice required not just acknowledgement of historical wrongs, but material compensation that would address ongoing structural inequalities. The Caribbean community's demand for reparations from European nations that had built their wealth on slavery, the calls for Britain to return artifacts stolen during colonialism and to compensate for the famines and the extraction, the arguments that development aid was inadequate when it was dwarfed by the continuing outflows through debt service and capital flight and unequal exchange. These demands challenged the narrative that the past was past and that former colonies simply needed to modernize and develop without addressing how underdevelopment had been deliberately created. The calculations of what was owed were staggering. The centuries of unpaid labor under slavery, the resources extracted without fair compensation, the industries destroyed to create captive markets, the lives lost to famines that were created or exacerbated by colonial policies, the cultural heritage stolen and displayed in European museums. Some economists attempted to quantify the flows, calculating that India had been drained of perhaps $45 trillion over 2 centuries of British rule, that the Caribbean economies had transferred wealth to Britain that dwarfed any aid received since independence, that the reparations paid by Haiti to France for the crime of liberating itself from slavery were greater than all development aid Haiti had received, and had contributed to poverty that persisted today. But the resistance to reparations was fierce. The arguments that current generations should not be held responsible for ancestors' crimes, ignoring that current generations continued to benefit from wealth that had been accumulated through colonialism, that the structural advantages that former colonial powers enjoyed were built on colonial extraction, that the poverty in formerly colonized regions was not natural or accidental, but was the direct result of policies that had enriched some by impoverishing others. The debate revealed discomfort with confronting how the contemporary world had been made, preference for narratives where European wealth resulted from superior culture or harder work rather than from systematic extraction and exploitation. Yet the movements for decolonization continued. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign that began in South Africa and spread to British universities demanding the removal of statues celebrating colonizers, the pressure on museums to return artifacts that had been stolen during colonialism, the calls for curriculum reform that would teach accurate histories rather than sanitized versions that minimized colonial violence, the recognition that symbols mattered because they shaped how people understood the past and therefore how they imagined the future. The defenders of statues argued about erasing history, but the activists responded that the statues had never been neutral history, but were celebrations of people who had committed atrocities, that removing them was not erasure, but was correcting the historical record by refusing to continue honoring those who should not be honored. The language itself was being decolonized. The recognition that terms like discovery implied lands had been empty before Europeans arrived, that development implied a universal path that all societies should follow with Europe as the model, that third world suggested hierarchy rather than simply difference, that the vocabulary of colonialism persisted in ways that naturalized inequalities that were actually constructed, the reclaiming of indigenous names for places that colonizers had renamed, the insistence on using terms that centered colonized people's perspectives rather than colonizers' viewpoints. These were small but meaningful challenges to linguistic structures that had been imposed through colonial power. The examples of countries that had charted different paths demonstrated that alternatives were possible. Cuba maintaining independence from US dominance despite enormous pressure, Vietnam reunifying after defeating French and then American colonialism, China's development showing that former colonies were not doomed to permanent subordination. But these examples were complicated by their own authoritarianism and violence, by the recognition that escaping neo-colonialism did not automatically produce justice or democracy, that the struggle for genuine sovereignty was distinct from the struggle for genuine freedom within societies, that both struggles were necessary, and neither was sufficient alone. The contemporary extractive relationships continued, often through corporations rather than through governments. The Chinese investments in African infrastructure, criticized as debt trap diplomacy, creating new dependencies even as they were defended as providing capital that Western institutions had long denied. The debate revealing anxieties about whether this was neo-colonialism of a different color or was genuine partnership on more equal terms. The mining corporations extracting minerals for smartphones and electric vehicles, the agricultural corporations controlling seed markets and export crops, the pharmaceutical corporations extracting genetic resources without compensation, the patterns of extraction persisting even as their specific forms evolved. But the resistance persisted too, the movements demanding that resources benefit the populations living above them rather than distant shareholders, the challenges to corporate power, the regional integration projects that attempted to build African or Latin American alternatives to dependency on former colonizers, the young people imagining futures that were not simply catching up to the West, but were building societies that addressed problems the West had created, that valued sustainability over endless growth, that centered community welfare over individual accumulation, that drew on pre-colonial traditions, not through romantic nostalgia, but through creative adaptation of values and practices that colonialism had suppressed but not destroyed. As this exploration draws toward its close, we are left with the recognition that colonialism is not safely contained in the past, but extends itself into the present through structures that outlived the formal empires, through debt and unequal exchange and the continuing extraction of resources, through borders that divide, and through languages that were imposed, through hierarchies that were internalized, and through knowledge systems that were invalidated, through the wealth gaps that are treated as natural, but that were deliberately created. The reckoning remains unfinished because the impacts remain ongoing, because the structures persist, because the questions of justice and restitution have been raised but not answered. The responsibility this history imposes is neither guilt nor defensiveness, but understanding. The recognition that the contemporary world was made through processes that advantaged some while disadvantaging others, that the advantages and disadvantages were not earned, but were imposed through colonial policies whose impacts persist in measurable and demonstrable ways. The work of decolonization is incomplete, requiring not just acknowledgement of historical injustice, but transformation of contemporary structures that preserve colonial relationships under new names, requiring attention to whose voices are centered when decisions are made about futures that belong to everyone, requiring the imagination to conceive of alternatives to the hierarchies and the extraction that colonialism normalized. Sleep now, carrying these histories and these ongoing struggles, these legacies of 5 centuries that shaped the world we have inherited, understanding that colonialism changed the world forever, not only through what it did, but through what it prevented, through the developments it interrupted, and the cultures it destroyed, and the alternatives it eliminated, through the poverty it created while building wealth, through the dependencies it established while proclaiming freedom, through the hierarchies it constructed while claiming to bring civilization. The formal empires ended, the flags came down, but the work of building a world that has genuinely moved beyond colonialism continues, requiring recognition of how we got here, acknowledgement of who paid the costs, and commitment to transformation that addresses not just the history, but its persistence in structures and assumptions that shape the present, and that will determine whether the future is simply continuation of colonial patterns, or is finally something different, something more just, something that honors the sovereignty and the dignity and the knowledge and the futures of all peoples, rather than subordinating the many to serve the few. Rest, but remember, the past is not past. It lives in the present, and what we do with that knowledge, whether we confront it or evade it, will shape the world we leave behind.